334 years before Christ. A 22-year-old young man crosses a strait with 40,000 soldiers. On the other side, the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Armies that total hundreds of thousands. Fortified cities that survived Nebuchadnezzar. Fortresses in the middle of the sea that were never conquered. 3 years later, all the lands where Abraham walked, where David reigned, where the prophets preached, where Jesus would be born centuries later. Everything was under Greek dominion. How was it possible so fast? And why did the same man who crucified 2,000 prisoners on a beach descend from his horse and bow before a Jewish priest? An encounter that some say was prophesied 200 years earlier. Alexander had a problem. Persia controlled the world from Egypt to Babylon, from Jerusalem to the Mediterranean. Cities, fortresses, ports. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers scattered across vast territories. Darius III commanded all of this from his palace in Persepolis. He had numbers. He had resources. He had time. Alexander, 40,000 men, supplies for a few months, and a narrow window of time before his own Greece became a target of Persian invasion. But he had something that no army in the East had faced before. A military formation that would change warfare forever. The Macedonian phalanx. Soldiers side by side, separated by less than 1 meter, each carrying a 6-meter spear called a sarissa. Spears so long that 3 rows of iron points projected beyond the first line. Enemies saw a wall of metal coming toward them, impossible to break through, impossible to flank if you attacked from the front, while the phalanx trapped the adversary. The cavalry attacked the flanks, hammer and anvil, simple, lethal. The first test came in 333 before Christ. At the Battle of Issus, Darius gathered a massive army and marched personally to crush that young invader. The exact numbers vary between accounts. But one thing was clear. Darius had overwhelming numerical superiority. The narrow plain between mountains and sea worked against him. He could not use all his soldiers at the same time. Then Alexander did what no one expected. He rode directly toward Darius, not toward the rear, not toward the flanks, straight to the center where the Persian king commanded personally. Darius's royal guard panicked when Alexander and his companion horsemen broke the formation. Darius himself turned and fled. His army saw the king leave. Total collapse. Macedonian victory. But Alexander did not pursue Darius toward the north. He turned toward the south. Strange decision. The enemy king was fleeing. Why not finish him immediately? Because there was something more dangerous than a king in flight. A fleet of hundreds of Persian warships in the Mediterranean, while Alexander marched inland. Those ships represented a mortal threat to Greece. Therefore, he decided to neutralize the entire Persian navy without fighting a single naval battle. How do you defeat an entire fleet without having a fleet of your own? Do you want to know the brilliant tactic that Alexander used? Keep watching, because what comes next is the most impossible siege of antiquity. January of 332 before Christ, Alexander ordered his troops to demolish the old continental Tyre. Every stone, every beam, every brick, everything went into the sea. 40,000 men working, carrying stone blocks through the sea, piling, compacting, building a solid bridge, crossing 800 meters of open water. The first 100 meters were relatively simple. Shallow water near the coast. The stones created a firm base, but the further they advanced, the deeper it became. At certain points, 5 meters deep, 6, the stones simply sank without creating a stable foundation. Days of work disappearing into the bottom of the sea. While they built, Tyrian ships came out attacking. Arrows rained down on the workers. Catapults launched stones. Men fell into the water. Some drowned trying to swim back. Others were hit while carrying rocks. Alexander responded by building wooden towers at the ends of the bridge, high towers so that archers could protect those working below. But Tyre had another weapon. Fire ships filled old ships with pitch, sulfur, dry wood. They set them on fire, directed them straight against the protection towers. The flames reached the wood. Entire towers turned into torches in a minute. Months of work burned. Men jumping into the sea in flames. Alexander needed maritime control. He got ships from Sidon and other already surrendered Phoenician cities. He blocked the port of Tyre. Now the defenders were trapped inside their own fortress. Construction continued 7 days a week, from dawn until dusk. The bridge grew meter by meter toward the island fortifications. July of 332, 7 months after the start. The bridge finally reached the walls of Tyre. Alexander mounted siege towers on the bridge itself, towers higher than the city's defenses, towers equipped with catapults and retractable walkways. The constant bombardment began, huge stones hitting the walls day and night. There was no time for repairs. Each damaged section received more hits before it could be repaired. Breaches began to open. First small cracks, then holes, then entire sections collapsing. Macedonian soldiers invaded through the openings. Others climbed with ladders while arrows flew. Fight house by house, street by street. Tyre fell after 7 months of resistance. But what came after the victory was not celebration. It was a message so brutal, it would travel faster than the army itself. What Alexander did with the survivors shocked even his own generals, and guaranteed that no other city would dare to resist in the same way. 8,000 men killed during the invasion, 30,000 people captured, women, children, elderly, entire families dragged out of their houses, sold as slaves in public auctions. But Alexander did not stop there. He ordered that 2,000 prisoners be separated from the group, soldiers who had defended the city until the last moment, men who refused to surrender even with the walls falling. Crosses were raised along the beach, one after another. 2,000 crosses lined up where any passing ship could see from afar. The prisoners were nailed alive, left there to die slowly under the sun. It took days. Some lasted almost a week before finally succumbing. Why this extreme brutality? Tyre had resisted for 7 months. It cost time that Alexander did not have, scarce resources, Macedonian lives. If he showed mercy now, every city to the south would think that resisting was worth it, that they could negotiate a better deal, that maybe they would survive. Therefore, he turned Tyre into a warning. Total resistance results in total annihilation, and the strategy worked perfectly. The news traveled faster than the army. Messengers ran to the south telling what they had seen. The crosses, the slaves, the city reduced to smoking rubble. Cities along the coast began sending delegations, offering surrender before Alexander even appeared on the horizon. Fear became a more effective weapon than catapults. But one city did not surrender, Gaza, the next great fortress on the way to Egypt. Commanded by a Persian official named Batis, he had seen the crosses in Tyre, heard about the massacres, knew exactly what to expect in case of losing, and still decided to resist. Gaza was not in the sea like Tyre. It had other advantages. The fortress occupied the top of a hill elevated 20 meters above the surrounding terrain. Thick walls surrounded the entire area. Batis garrisoned the place with Arab soldiers and Persian mercenaries, supplies stored for months. Alexander arrived in September of 332. His engineers evaluated the situation. Conclusion: impossible to take quickly. But Alexander did not have months to waste. and he could not leave another hostile fortress controlling the route to Egypt. Therefore, he decided to build an artificial mountain. The siege of Gaza would be even more brutal than Tyre, and would end with one of the most shocking executions of antiquity. If the fortress is on a hill, build a larger hill. Alexander ordered that they begin to pile earth and stones on the south side of Gaza, creating a huge ramp, rising to the height of the defenses, while they built above. Others dug tunnels below, mining the foundations. Brutal work under the desert heat. The temperature exceeded 40 degrees. Arrows from Gaza constantly falling on those carrying stone. There was no cover, no shadow. Men fainted from exhaustion. Others were hit and fell from the ramp under construction. The work continued anyway. 2 months of construction under constant attack. During reconnaissance of the defenses, something unexpected happened. An arrow pierced Alexander's armor and entered deep into his right shoulder. The arrow got stuck, went through muscle, possibly hit bone. Guards carried Alexander back to the camp while blood dripped down the armor. Philip, the chief physician, examined the wound. Verdict: Alexander needed to stop. Rest. Let the shoulder heal before returning to combat. Infection was a mortal risk in deep wounds. Alexander refused. Every day of siege gave more time for Persia to reorganize forces. Gaza needed to fall. He would continue commanding, and he continued. Even with his shoulder bandaged, he did personal reconnaissance, inspected the works, gave orders, risked new arrows. The ramp grew. After 2 months, it reached the height of the south walls. Siege towers were dragged up the ramp. Catapults began bombardment simultaneously. The tunnels under the fortifications were set on fire. November of 332. Entire sections of the walls collapsed when the foundations gave way. Macedonian troops invaded through multiple breaches, fought house by house. Gaza resisted until there was no more way to resist. When the battle ended, Battis was found alive, wounded, surrounded by the corpses of his men, but alive and refusing to kneel, even captured. Alexander remembered the Iliad. Achilles had dragged Hector's body around Troy after killing him in combat. Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad on his campaigns. He saw himself as a new Achilles. He decided to imitate his literary hero. Chains were passed through Battis's ankles. He was tied behind a chariot. Alexander ordered the horses to gallop around the city. Battis was dragged to death, his body torn apart by the sand and stones. Deliberately symbolic execution. Achilles and Hector represented. The entire male population of Gaza was executed. Women and children sold as slaves. The city was repopulated with settlers from neighboring regions. 2 sieges, 2 complete massacres. Tyre and Gaza, annihilated in months. The next city on the way was Jerusalem. And Jerusalem faced an impossible dilemma: surrender and betray Persia, or resist and become another Tyre. Jerusalem had a problem. The Jews were technically under Persian dominion. They had paid tributes to Darius, supplied soldiers when requested, maintained agreements with the empire that Alexander was destroying piece by piece. Technical treason in the eyes of a conqueror who had just crucified 2,000 men on a beach, and he was coming from the south. Every city between Gaza and Jerusalem had heard about the executions, about the families sold as slaves, about Gaza leveled until not one stone was left upon another. Jaddua, the high priest, faced an impossible choice. To resist meant becoming another Tyre. To surrender meant betraying agreements with Persia, which technically still existed, even with Darius fleeing to the north. But Jerusalem did not have the defenses of Tyre or Gaza. It was not surrounded by water. It had no natural fortified hill. If Alexander decided to attack, the city would fall in days. Then Jaddua did something completely unexpected. He dressed in the ceremonial robes of the high priest. Blue tunic, robes with golden bells on the edges, mitre with a gold plate engraved with the holy name of God, garments that were only used in the most important ceremonies of the temple. He left Jerusalem accompanied by other priests, all dressed in pure white. They carried holy scrolls. They went to meet Alexander before he reached the gates, without weapons, without soldiers, only men in white carrying ancient texts. When Alexander saw the procession coming toward him, something completely unexpected happened. He descended from his horse. His generals were visibly confused. Parmenion, the most experienced commander, asked directly why a conqueror, who had just massacred 2 entire cities, showed respect to a priest of a city that had supported his enemies. Alexander responded that he had seen that man in a dream before. In the dream, the man dressed in white promised him victory over Persia. Historians debate if this really happened in this way, but the historical result is indisputable. Alexander did not destroy Jerusalem. He entered peacefully, allowed the Jews to keep their laws and religious practices. He offered exemption from tributes during sabbatical years, when Jewish law prohibited agricultural work, privileges that no other conquered city received. Jaddua took Alexander to the temple. He showed scrolls of the prophet Daniel, prophecies written approximately 200 years earlier. During the Babylonian exile, the texts described 4 world empires. The Third Empire, represented by a swift leopard, would quickly conquer all Persian territory before dividing into 4 parts. Alexander recognized his own campaign in the description: rapid conquest, unprecedented speed, immense territory taken in a few years. Texts written 2 centuries before, describing patterns that he was creating at that moment. And that changed everything. Alexander gave more privileges to the Jews, but Darius still lived, and the war was far from over. From Jerusalem, Alexander marched toward Egypt. No serious resistance. The Egyptians had suffered under Persian rule for decades. They saw Alexander as a liberator, not an invader. In weeks, he controlled the entire Nile Delta. He was crowned pharaoh according to traditions that dated back 3,000 years. He founded Alexandria in a strategic position on the coast. The city would eventually become the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Decades later, it would be there where Jewish scribes would produce the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, allowing the Hellenized world to access the texts that before only existed in Hebrew. But Darius still lived. The Persian king had fled twice, but he continued gathering armies. He continued controlling the eastern provinces. He continued representing a threat as long as he breathed. Alexander needed to finish what he started. In 331 before Christ, he marched toward the northeast, crossed the Euphrates, crossed the Tigris, the rivers that defined Mesopotamia where Abraham was born, where Daniel interpreted dreams for kings, where Ezekiel prophesied by the canals. Darius awaited him near Gaugamela, in the north of present-day Iraq. He had gathered the largest army he could assemble. The exact numbers are debated. But one thing was clear: massive numerical superiority over the Macedonians. He had chosen flat terrain, perfect for war chariots and large-scale cavalry. He even brought elephants from India. This would be the definitive battle. If Alexander lost there, his entire campaign would end. He would be trapped in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded with no escape routes. If he won, the Persian Empire would end. The battle began at dawn in October of 331. Alexander used a variation of the previous tactic. The phalanx held the center, but this time he feigned a movement toward the right. Darius responded by moving his forces to block. That created a gap. Alexander saw the opening, formed a cavalry wedge, and charged straight through the gap. not toward the rear, straight toward where Darius commanded. For the third time, in 3 years, Alexander rode straight against the Persian king. For the third time, Darius saw that young Macedonian coming toward him, surrounded by elite cavalry. For the third time, Darius fled. His army saw the king leave. Morale collapsed. Soldiers abandoned positions. They tried to flee. They became an easy target for Macedonian cavalry. Massacre. Tens of thousands dead. Darius fled toward the east and would eventually be killed by his own nobles. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the East for more than 2 centuries, was destroyed. Babylon, the richest city of the ancient world, opened its doors without a fight. The same city where Nebuchadnezzar had ruled, where Daniel interpreted dreams and saw visions, where Jews had lived exiled for 70 years. Alexander entered Babylon in November of 331, and what he did there would change the future of the scriptures. The conquest was complete, but the consequences would last centuries and directly affect how the Bible would be preserved and diffused. In 3 years, Alexander had conquered everything. From Egypt to Mesopotamia, from Jerusalem to the coasts of the Mediterranean, all the lands where patriarchs walked, where prophets preached, where kings of Israel and Judah ruled. Everything was now under Greek dominion, but Alexander did something that other conquerors did not do. He did not simply destroy local cultures and impose Greek traditions by force. He mixed, fused, created something new in Babylon. He respected the ancient temples, ordered restorations, kept local priests in their positions, studied Babylonian astronomy, learned about administrative systems that had worked for 1,000 years. He allowed Jews to serve in his army, maintaining religious observances, something unprecedented. Soldiers could follow dietary laws, rest on the Sabbath, maintain practices that other generals would have prohibited, and he spread the Greek language throughout all conquered territory. This would have enormous consequences. Centuries later, when Jesus was born, the entire Mediterranean world spoke Greek. The scriptures had been translated into Greek in Alexandria. The New Testament would be written in Greek. All of this because Alexander created a common culture that connected different peoples. He died young, barely 32 years old. His empire was divided among his generals, exactly as Daniel had prophesied 200 years before. 4 main divisions, 4 kingdoms where before there was one. Ptolemy stayed with Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra. Seleucus controlled Syria and Mesopotamia. Antigonus took Greece. Lysimachus stayed with Asia Minor. Jerusalem was trapped between the Ptolemies and Seleucids. It changed hands multiple times, eventually. This would lead to the Maccabean Revolt, when a Seleucid ruler tried to force total Hellenization. But Greek influence remained in the apocryphal books written in Greek, in the Septuagint translated in Alexandria, in the very structure of Jewish thought that began to dialogue with Greek philosophy. When Paul preached in synagogues scattered throughout the Roman Empire, centuries later he used the Septuagint. When he wrote his letters, he wrote in Greek. When the gospel spread beyond Judea, it spread in a language that everyone understood, Greek, the language that Alexander brought to the lands of the Bible. 3 years of conquest. 3 years that changed the course of history. 3 years that connected East and West in a way they had never been connected before. And it all began with a 22-year-old young man crossing a strait with 40,000 soldiers, determined to do the impossible, to conquer the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But decades before Alexander, another conqueror had marched on Jerusalem, and that one did not spare the city. Nebuchadnezzar completely destroyed the temple and carried the people in chains to exile in Babylon.